Hello, I hope you're ready now to study the court system. And before we get to the court system, we're still in our beginning and we're taking a step back and we're thinking, well, what do the courts do? And what do judges do? And actually, if you remember from my background, I was a law clerk to a judge, so I actually got to decide those cases with the judge. And it's important to look at the case level first, and then we'll look at the structure for a bit. So think about what is law, as we talked about last week. Now we're looking to see how is it created. And it comes from sources already. The judge doesn't just pull it from the air, but there's a very important part of our legal system in the United States, at least, and that is called common law. And it's precedent, Precent, case precedent. The idea that the law is shaped case by case. Now, you might take this for granted in your life, and if you think that it's about fairness, and you might say, well, of course, I want to be treated like that other person was treated. And the same thing is true in court. And maybe you're even getting that from what you've taken for granted here, that we have consistency in the law from person to person, from case to case. And we call that case precedent, and in Latin, the term is stare decisis, the idea of deciding based on the cases. But there are other countries that don't do it that way. I teach international law as well, and I could tell you that civil law systems, that's the contrast or the alternative, really, to common law. So we have common law basing it on the cases because our court system came from Old England. And we, as a country, were formed from that. That was our history. And so the founders of this country set up common law system, and the courts are based on that, as you'll see. Well, in other countries, they have a civil law system. It's different than the civil criminal we talked about last time. It's the idea of deciding cases based on rules that come from a rule book that's legislatively based, and not necessarily, you can cite those other cases, but the judge is not bound by them. It's not binding precedent in the same way. So each one who comes into the court, the rules picked out and applied to them. That sounds very foreign to you, I'm sure, because you take for granted that you can argue, but judge, that last case was treated this way. That last person had that. And that's how we do it in this country, because we have this idea that the judge doesn't pull it from the air or even from a rule book, but from other cases. And that way we learn how to brief a case. We learn how to think of a case and distinguish our case from that. If we don't want it applied to us, we say, but that was a private university, we're a public university, so that doesn't apply. You distinguish away. And that's the idea, that you still need to look at the case precedent and decide, or at least argue, does it apply to you or does it not apply to you? Either way, we're looking at the cases. And that's why they're such a very important part of this course, as they are a very important part of our legal system. So keep that in mind. That's case precedent, common law, as we look at the courts themselves. And there's one state in the United States that does not have common law. I want you to think for a moment of a state that didn't come from Old England like the others. I think I feel it. Some of you are thinking it, and that is Louisiana. So Louisiana is the only state in the United States that's a civil law system, the one that the rule book, as I described, not based on case precedent in quite the same way as binding on the judge. And then we have other countries like France. That was your clue, because Louisiana came from France. Germany, Japan, most of Europe is really a civil law kind of a system. So we have a common law system. We're about to go look at the courts and see how that is and where those laws are applied. And we have two sets of courts in this country. We have federal courts and state courts. And you might have experienced this if you've already had jury duty, where you think, well, wait a minute, didn't I just have jury duty? And maybe I wasn't chosen for a jury, as I'm guessing you weren't. And then you think, which we're going to look at when we look at the legal system, you'll see why that is, the litigation process, why maybe you weren't chosen. But in any case, you know you went to a court and wait, this is a different court. And that's because they can be located in the very same city. So in Bridgeport, Connecticut, you have a federal courthouse and a state courthouse. And you could be chosen or serving at either one for state trials or federal trials. And that's how we do it in this country. You're going to see when we look at jurisdiction, that means authority of the court, why certain cases go into state court, certain cases go into federal court, and perhaps someday you'll be a plaintiff, the one bringing that case. And in that case, civil case, you're the plaintiff, that's what we call you. You're going to get familiar with these terms. You might choose which court do you go, which court, and that could be federal or state, which state would you bring this? Because every state is going to have its own court system. And then the federal, as you'll see, split across the United States. And we have different levels of court. So I'm giving you, like I said, the basic outline, and you're going to study this as we go through this module. You'll see, well, there's an entry level court. We call that court of general subject matter jurisdiction because that's the entry level and they have authority over all sorts of cases, all sorts of subject matter of cases. Now, some of those courts are courts of limited jurisdiction, meaning their specialty, their authority, the jurisdiction is only on certain kinds of cases. So it could be probate court, it could be small claims court, which defines its jurisdiction based on dollar amount. So cases may be under $5,000 go to the small claims court. You could have special courts based on types of cases like municipal court for traffic violations. It could be a court based on a county, like Sullivan County Court would only be cases that arise in Sullivan County. So it could be jurisdiction limited based on geography, on types of cases, on the amount of money that's involved in that case. And then we have those entry level subject matter general jurisdiction, right, where they have all kinds of cases, all kinds of types of cases. And then there's always, that we're describing really right now, all court systems. These are different states, but they could all call different names, but they have this function. But there's then going to be some place to appeal. There's always a court that you could appeal, a middle level appeal. And you always have at least one right to appeal. So every one of these systems is going to set that up for you, federal and state. So in the federal system, we call that district court. I already answered it for you, district court, right? That is our entry level when you first bring a case. And then there's going to be a court of appeals above it. And they might have different names, but that's the function in all of these systems, state and federal. And then there's going to be a top court, which you think of right away as a Supreme Court. Some courts, some actually states really, like New York State, doesn't even call it a Supreme Court. It's still the top level court of review, but they call it the Court of Appeals. So beware of names, but the function is still the same. And that one is a discretionary kind of appeal. So you could ask to bring your case to the Supreme Court, to the top court, but will you actually get there? That court has the right to turn you down. They have only a limited number of cases that they hear a year. This is for the U.S. Supreme Court, the federal one, and for those state courts as well. There's always a top court, usually called a Supreme Court, that is a limited number of cases that you can argue to get your case up there, and that would be the end place within that state, the final court of review for the decision of the original judge to see if there was an error in law applied along the way. Okay, so that's sort of the basics of where you're going to see in this court system. And of course, you're going to jump right in and see more. And one last thing, and that is the role of the judge in terms of the job of judge. So I mentioned state and federal, and those judges that are within those courts are chosen in a different way. So in the state court system, they tend to be either elected positions or appointed perhaps by the governor, and every state has the right to set it up differently and then to have that system. But in the federal, I really want to focus on, so that applies everywhere, and that is a very important role because in the federal system, we have three branches of government: the judicial branch, which is what we're discussing now, and we have the executive branch, that's the president, and then we have Congress, which is the legislative branch. And the way our Constitution was set up, as you'll learn in the Constitution chapter, is that there's a division of power, separation of powers, we call it, because we didn't want one branch to get too powerful. We came from Old England, again, where there were problems, we'll say, if you were the citizen, because the king perhaps got too powerful, or there might have been a dictator, it wasn't a democracy. So we want to be very careful to make sure that the executive branch in particular did not get too powerful and was not unchecked. So that's why we have checks and balances between the branches of government. And when we talk about the court system, it has to have that power of judicial review to make sure that the other two branches don't violate the Constitution. It's a very important role. And because it was so important in the federal system, we decided we have to give those judges life terms because we don't want them to be subject to politics like the other branches of government. We want those judges to do what's fair and just under the law and apply and interpret the Constitution, but not be influenced by whether they might lose their job over it, not be influenced by whether that particular opinion might be popular at this point in time. Perhaps there's much racism going on, and we want to make sure that those judges are above that, the politics of who and the majority view might be shaping towards. We want to have it be fair and just rights, even if it's not a popular decision. And so that's why we separated out the judicial branch and we gave those judges, all federal judges in the courts you're going to learn, not just the US Supreme Court, but the district court and the Court of Appeals, all of those judges have life terms. That means they could be judged for many, many years, way longer than the President of the United States in one term or two. And so when they are selected by the other two branches of government. That's the place where some politics comes in because those two are the political branches. So the President of the United States nominates the judges and justices, the Supreme Court as well, of course, and then the Congress, in particular the Senate, confirms those judges if they find that the judge is qualified. So that judge has gone through the vetting process, every federal judge, of two branches of government in order to be selected. So now coming back to you, the people, you have a very important role in this process because you, as the citizens, get to elect those representatives. You get to elect your senators and your Congress people, House of Representatives, and your president. So when you do vote, you must always think that who you vote for will influence who are the judges that are going to be in this system that you're about to learn about for a very, very long time, for their entire lives, well beyond the term of any of those senators or president, because of the life term that we've given those judges to protect them from the political process. So, very important role, very important job of those judges, especially, as we said, because the cases are going to shape the law and shape the interpretation of our rights in this system. And it's a very important role for the judges, very important role of the courts in our society. And you're about to jump right in and learn how it is that those courts are set up, and then how you can bring a case to defend your rights or even your contract or your injuries to have your remedy, how you work your way through those courts so that you will be a participant in this system. Enjoy your exploration, and here we go.